Tone does matter here.
It costs us compassion. It costs us understanding. It costs us good journalism.
It's really little.
The stories our correspondents tell teach us about our world and ourselves.
There's just simply no way to convince Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear program.
Stories from Syria, South Sudan, Haiti, India, North Korea. Stories of war, tragedy, hope, resilience. Stories of humanity. Stories from Washington, Paris, Moscow, Mosul, Istanbul. Stories of struggles, hate.
Call. Explosives. Let's go. Run.
Stories of goodness, stories of power. The world may seem big, but it is our job as journalists to help people understand how tiny it really is. Because when we see and hear and read their reports, we realize we're not that different from our neighbors thousands of kilometers away. If your child was starving, what would the look be on your face? If your family was missing in the wake of a disaster zone, what would you want people to know? If your rights and freedoms as a citizen were threatened, what would you say? Why shouldn't we hear those people? Why shouldn't we see them? Why shouldn't we cover them? Forget the cost, forget the time, forget the travel. Covering the world matters. And tonight we're here to talk about how we do it. Hello there, I'm Peter Mansbridge. You're looking into the Barbara Frum Atrium here at the CBC Broadcasting Centre. Barbara Frum, we've been missing her for 25 years now, since she passed away. But this atrium in the heart of CBC Toronto is named after her. Today we're here in the atrium area of the CBC to talk to our foreign correspondents about the way they do their work, the challenges they face in different parts of the world. We are also live on Facebook and YouTube. So if you're watching on those two social platforms, go to the comments section and write in a question. You've got a question for anyone here, please ask it. And obviously, we ask those here in the audience to do the same. So who's on the panel? Starting from my far right, Matt Kwong. From our Washington Bureau, Matt is one of our online reporters in Washington and is incredibly well pursued by readers around the globe for his take on the interesting things that are happening in our neighbor to the south. On this side, Neil Koksel, who's based in Istanbul right now, is covering the story in Turkey, another incredible unfolding story, and Neil has been right in the middle of it. How does she do that? How does she report? Those questions we want to hear from you. Margaret Evans, who is, just most recently, was in Manchester last week. But before that, she was in South Sudan, and she made the world realize the famine, the starvation, and the civil war that is going on in that country, and impact is what you want in journalism. Margaret had impact in that story. She had it with viewers, and it clearly had some impact on the government as well, who've changed or have upped their commitment to the situation in South Sudan and the other neighboring countries in Northeast Africa that are suffering the same fate. Sasha Petrusik, where has he just been? He's been in North Korea. Has he got stories to tell? So you want to ask about that. And over here, Keith Bogue, my longtime partner on many different stories in Ottawa and now in Washington. Keith and Matt have the, how do you come up with a story in Washington these days? I mean, there's just nothing going on there. And Nala Ayed here beside me. Nala was also in Manchester last week, was in France before that, covered the unfolding story in Iran. Both Nala and Margaret have done many stories on the situation of refugees fleeing Syria and crossing Europe. So you're looking at some great correspondents here with stories to tell, anxious to answer your questions. Once again, for those watching on social media, we want you to write your questions in the comments section of whether it's Facebook or YouTube, and we'll get them on here right now. Just make sure you include your name, obviously. So our first question is coming from the audience, and Katie over here has our question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dev from the Mosaic Institute. My question is, given the tumultuous environment that is often there in overseas places, what is the relationship between the Canadian government and the foreign correspondents? Is there any support that's provided?
Support that's provided. Okay, well, Nala, can you handle that one to start?
It's not an official or a formal support, as you might imagine, but often when we go somewhere that's a bit dodgy, we do actually connect with an embassy or a representative who's there. As you know, even on the website of the government, Foreign Affairs, what's it called now? Global Affairs Canada. It encourages people to register when you go somewhere like that. We will do that if it's somewhere that's where you might run into trouble.
I'll jump in there because in Istanbul we met with the consul general there, and he said, just so you know, I mean, obviously they'll try to help as much as they can, but having a Canadian passport, he said, won't necessarily help. I also happen to have a Turkish passport, so they're there, but they're also very realistic about what they can and can't do in certain countries.
And in fact, in most cases, they advise us not to go to many of the places that we're actually going to.
It's interesting the number of correspondents, foreign correspondents, who have, when they have the option to have two passports. It makes sense. In some of these countries, you know, they check very carefully where you've been, and sometimes you don't necessarily want them to know where you've just been. So having two passports legally, when you have that option, is a good thing. All right, next question also here from the audience, and where's Hillary? They're right here, over here. Hillary, who have you got?
Hi there, my name is Sonia, and this question is for anyone on the panel. I'm wondering, when you're reporting abroad, has there ever been a time, or do you ever feel disconnected from home, especially if there's a big news story that's happening at home in Canada?
This is a good one to ask them, because they're usually arguing nothing that's happening at home can be as important as this story that I've got to tell you here right now. Margaret, do you feel disconnected from home?
Sometimes. I mean, my family's pretty good at keeping me connected in a way, and you know, it's important to keep in touch with the people at home. But it's true that you do, you know, you tend to kind of hate the Canadian stories. It's like, what do you mean you're going to knock my story off tonight? It becomes that kind of, you know, a negotiation with the desk. I'm trying to think of an example, you know, being knocked off recently, but it can happen. You can spend, you know, a long time going off and doing, you know, you did a documentary in Zimbabwe. It was 17 minutes, and that's a lot of airtime that you're kind of waiting to fill, and then, you know, news happens, and that's what we do, and so you kind of have to be graceful and let go and call home a lot.
You know, there's kind of a pendulum to the news cycle where there'll be times when foreign news dominates, and the Canadian reporters are desperate to get on the air, and they're saying, come on, I can't get on. You got another Margaret Evans piece, you got another Nala Ayed piece. They were just on last night, what about me? And then the opposite happens, as Margaret explained. So, and you can sense that pendulum yourself at times when a foreign story will dominate, and when it does, it's obviously taking something else off the news, just like the opposite is the case.
And right now, we're battling the Washington. I mean, we really notice the difference. We just, it's this year, we get on a lot less, yeah.
Yeah, well then, why don't we ask a Washington question? Because Nicole Narum asks off social media, what makes a source reliable? Now, any of these correspondents can handle that, but so much of what's happening in Washington right now, and so much of what's happening in the United States is often based on anonymous sourcing. So, you know, journalists have to make the decision. You know, how am I convinced that's a reliable source? Keith.
Well, I think we trust our sources the way, first of all, in the way that we learn to trust the people that we know. We have history with them. We respect what they know. we understand what their own access is to the story, which is important. Sometimes that trust is betrayed, and when it is, that source is essentially dead, if it's truly betrayed. A source can be wrong, or events can change, but if you're betrayed by a source, that's a very significant development in your relationship, and it usually means it's going downhill. But you build these relationships over time. You sustain them in all kinds of different ways, and the trust level works both ways. You report fairly, and that source, if they're a legitimate and credible and valuable source, will remain a source for you. And reporting fairly also means, in many circumstances, protecting their identity. It's just a part of the way the job is done, particularly on sensitive stories. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just to jump on Keith's point there, I can think of examples. Washington is a place that's filled with think tanks and experts and pundits. And in my position, I talk to a lot of these people. So how do you know when the source you're talking to is the right expert? It sounds silly to say, and it's a very common sense sort of thing to say, but you do some background research, you Google people. I have done interviews that have lasted 45 minutes before, and it's just sometimes it's sort of instinct. That one felt a little bit off. Let's look into what this think tank is, and let's look into who this guy is. If I find out this person has only done interviews with RT, that's Russia Today, which is a sort of a government mouthpiece of the Russian government, you might not want to use that interview. Just forget about the 45 minutes you spent on the phone with this person. That is not a reliable source.
Nala?
Just as an addendum to that, if we do get a tip that we're not sure about, the key for me and for all of us, the way we work, is to look for other sources that can confirm what you've learned. So in my case, one example that always sticks in my mind is we got a source telling us that there were Canadian arms in the hands of rebel fighters in Yemen. I mean, mind-blowing. So I can't just go with that. It took us 6 months to prove that. We talked to arms experts from NGOs and from government and from freelancers. We tried to get as many different voices as possible to ensure that we were not imparting wrong information.
Let me ask Neil the same question, because in Turkey right now, dealing with sources, the difficulty for sources, the challenge for them is not about the possibility of losing their job, it's about the possibility of losing their life, who they're talking to and what they're saying.
Yeah, it's changed even in the last 2 years. We first went to Turkey 2 years ago, and we're there for 6 months. And just being back over these last 6 months, the number of people who won't talk to you has gone up exponentially. Even for something routine, ahead of the referendum, just like there is here, you get access to a couple of polling stations just to get some B-roll, maybe talk to people as they leave, but just pictures even. So we called someone who an official told us we could speak to, just to say, which polling station can we have access to? Really routine, nothing controversial. And as soon as my producer, videographer, called them, he hung up on him. Like, he said journalist, and he hung up the phone. That's the level of fear. And when you add Canadian media to it now, it used to be 2 years ago, and being Turkish, people would say, oh, it's a Turkish girl who's done well in Canada, how exciting, we're so proud of you. And people were very open to speaking, and not just because I'm Turkish, but they were open to speaking. Just the shift in the last 2 years, the people who don't want to give their opinion, leading up to the referendum, politicians were telling me that people don't want to tell them how they're going to vote, but they might gesture, they're saying, I'm going to vote this way, but their gestures are saying something else. People are worried about losing their jobs, their livelihoods. It's become the kind of place where a husband might tell on a wife, and get her in serious trouble, get her taken to court.
All right. One thing that this is all leading to, this question about sourcing. We've watched the President of the United States claim fake news a lot lately, and he bases a lot of his criticism on the media on anonymous sources, which of course is odd, seeing he used to use them all the time when he was a candidate, and his whole charge against Obama and his birth certificate was based on anonymous sources. However, he's turned fake news into an issue that confronts the media and it confronts politicians. And it confronted Keith when he was trying to do his story, and I want you to see how he handled it. Watch this.
The American people triggered the impeachment of Richard Nixon in large part because they believed and trusted the media's reporting about Watergate. This president has called his media critics the enemy of the people, and his supporters are inclined to believe that.
He's attacking the mainstream media because frankly, they're publishing a lot of fake news. What he's trying to do is basically destroy their credibility, and he has a good shot of doing it because at this point he's bigger than they are.
All the stuff about Russia and things like that, there's definitely fake news, and I believe it's organized to hurt Trump.
The shadow of Moscow seems to haunt President Trump.
All the stuff about Russia, Russians' attempts to influence the election, their meetings with Trump campaign staff, actually comes from national security and intelligence agencies. But Trump has disparaged them too. So far, in fact, he's been far more critical of the CIA, the FBI, CNN, and the New York Times than he has been of Vladimir Putin. That's an odd thing, and it's not fake news.
I'm sure we're going to have more questions on fake news as we carry on through this evening. But let me ask this next one, coming up from social media. John Snook asks, how does any one of you balance the risk of danger against the need to get the story when you're working in areas of conflict? I think Margaret is certainly, and Nola, both will have comments on this, but Margaret was just in Aleppo not that long ago, and has been constantly confronted in different places with that risk of danger and how you weigh the choices you make.
Well, you can't tell the story if you can't go there. You can't tell the story if you're dead. So that's kind of the most fundamental thing that you're weighing up. It's the same with the sourcing. Different kinds of stories, in a way. There are lots of places that news organizations actually don't go, or you get news organizations rewriting other people's stories. You don't know if you can't get there. And we're all humans. We're Canadians. We have an outward view, I think most of us, and we want to know about the rest of the world. And so it's kind of tapping into your basic humanity in a sense. Journalists are curious people in any case. And it is the most fundamental question that people face in life or death situations. How do they handle it? I still have memories of covering Gaza, or even the refugees, where you see parents. A man. This was a bombing campaign in Gaza, and a father saying to me, "My problem is I'm ashamed because I'm afraid, and I'm showing that fear to my children. They're looking to me to give them security and comfort, and I can't hide my own fear." And I think those are, they're things that we can't even imagine, and being able to kind of translate that, I think it brings us all closer together and have greater understanding. It sounds very kind of kumbaya-ish, and I apologize for that, but that's what it's about, and that's, you do make the decision and you do weigh the risks. You don't go in, in a haphazard fashion. You try to be as safe as possible and keep your team as safe as possible, but there are risks, and you make a decision and go.
All right, I want to bring Nola in on this, but I'm going to bring her in on what you just mentioned a few moments ago, and that's the refugee story. And being there to try and cover it. Here's a clip from one of Nola's stories on that subject. Watch this.
On a long trail of obstacles, this is one of the harder days. As they march to the Croatian border, they face a dual threat: heat and uncertainty. For 14-year-old Abi from Syria, add 1 minute.
I am so tired now, and I want my mother. And
where is your mother?
My mother in my country. Syria. Yes.
As they prepare to confront the cornfields and a new border, there is a sense of urgency here.
You need to drink a lot of water because it's hot.
Like marathon runners, they pause just long enough to get what they need. A journey guided more by hope than by hard information.
We don't know. Just we're trying.
Yet another busload coming, heading towards the Croatian border.
What they know for sure is that this may be their only way to get to Western Europe. What they don't know is whether Croatia's borders are open, whether Slovenia's borders are open. They ask us those questions, and there are few answers.
So the challenge there is trying to understand their plight, understand what they're going through, understand the risks and the dangers they're facing.
Absolutely. And it can only happen if you spend enough time actually talking to them. And of course, I'm in that particular situation, and it's not always the case. I'm blessed in that I do speak Arabic, and a lot of the people who were walking along that route were only Arabic speakers. So I heard all kinds of stories, both in Arabic and in English. A lot of people did talk to us in English and in French. So that was an important part of it. But also not talking to those who come to the camera. I mean, that little girl is not your natural interview on a migrant trail. I went up to her because I saw her there among a number of men, and I just wondered, why is she there? There she is, a 12, 13-year-old. Her mother is back in Syria. It's important to hear those stories out. Of course, you only heard a small clip there, but we had a long conversation, and I learned more from that little girl than I did in several other interviews that we had that day.
But part of that challenge you faced was that little girl and others were asking you questions.
They were, and that came up a lot.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, listen, we were looking for information on our own. So I was saying to people at the Hungarian border with Serbia, for example, have you heard where the crossing is going to be now that you guys probably remember there was a big fence that was put up and stopped people from crossing? So we'd ask them. And so when we heard information and people asked us, what do you do? I said, well, I heard that this is where it's happening. People are moving on to the next crossing. It's impossible you've got to keep yourself neutral, you've got to keep yourself out of the story. But if I've just learned from a policeman that they're directing people to a bus on the other side, why would I not share that information? That's my honest human reaction.
Some of the dilemmas that face journalists on these kind of stories. All right, the next question is here in the audience, and it's right here. Go ahead.
As a foreign correspondent, you have to pay attention to the cultural differences that exist, but at the same time, you have to frame the news from a Canadian perspective. So how do you negotiate sort of boundaries of this cultural relativism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you want to try it, Neil?
We've been talking a lot about how hard it is sometimes to get the desks to take our stories, even though we've been sent to these countries. And my answer to that always is that Canada is the world. So the places we're at, I was born in Turkey, people are from the Philippines. Even if you're not from any of these countries, I feel like Canadians are interested in these cultures anyway. So it shouldn't be hard to get these stories on the air because we're the kind of audience that is hungry for them. In terms of navigating the differences, I think for me, there's a familiarity because I'm from Turkey, but no matter where you are, whether it's a small town in Ontario or a foreign country, we're people. So if you treat people with respect and they understand you're not there to exploit them, you're there because you honestly want to hear their story, then they'll talk to you. But people, the people we're speaking to aren't stupid. They can tell if you're there just for a headline or just for a clip. So that's how I and all of us approach these stories. They're human beings, just like we are, no matter where they live in the world. And it's when journalists lose that, I'm getting angry just thinking about it, when you hear the kinds of questions they ask people without doing their research or without being sensitive to where the people we're talking to are coming from, it's not journalism, right?
Sasha, you on the same point. I mean, Sasha's based in Beijing, which is a society obviously unlike ours, but he's just come back from North Korea, where it's a really closed society, and trying to navigate some of those differences, but yet tell the story in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think you go in with your eyes wide open. I think you have to accept cultural differences, but I think at the same time you have to ask tough questions when you have to do that. You're trying to get the clear information or information that's as clear as possible. There are all kinds of differences, starting with the basic one of language very often, other ones as well. But I think in most parts of the world where I've worked, what Nil is saying, that people are very eager to actually tell their stories. So here's somebody who's actually come from the other side of the world to hear what they have to say. And, you know, they may be important people, they may be politicians or generals, but most often the people that we talk to are not. They're average people in those societies. And here's this Canadian who's come from the other side of the world, and they want to know what their problem is, or what they have to say, or what they have to tell other Canadians even. And it's, I think most people see that as, they don't look at me as someone who's trying to exploit them. They look at me as someone who's trying to help them and actually give them a voice. And they wouldn't have that if I wasn't there, if I didn't go to the other side of the world. So the cultural differences, I think in many cases they kind of melt away. Obviously there's exceptions to that. There's animosity if in fact those people want to confront you. But in most cases I would say it's the opposite.
All right, moving on online. Linda Marie Drosy writes from Hockley Valley, which is a great kind of resort area north of Toronto. How do the Washington reporters handle the obvious combative atmosphere in the press room at the White House? Do they see this changing at any time in the near future? Matt, I want you to start this, not just in the White House, but I remember that story you told about trying to cover Christie and basically getting thrown out of their press area. You ended up getting a better story by not being in the press area.
Right. Well, this is about me trying to cover Chris Christie's announcement that he's running for president. Chris Christie being the New Jersey governor. A couple years ago, he was making this big announcement at Livingston High School, at his hometown, and you know, for weeks, I pestered his people trying to get press accreditation just so I could be in that gymnasium, just so I could write that color feature that I had in my mind of, being there at Chris Christie's high school when he announced he was running for president. And I didn't get in. Basically, what ended up being sort of a roadblock, though, turned out to be a blessing for my story. I actually got a richer story out of it, because what ended up happening was I ended up actually standing outside of Chris Christie's high school, watching him give a speech with the entire class of 1980 that graduated with Chris Christie. People who brought their yearbooks, people who had remembered him as the high school star catcher on the team. And I got all these great anecdotes, stuff that I probably wouldn't have gotten had I actually gotten that access into the gymnasium, where I would have just sat there with the press pen, kind of listening to the same speech that we ended up getting outside that gymnasium.
Keith, you've watched the situation unfold in Washington for some years through a number of presidents. When you see what's going on there now in that White House briefing room, as Matt mentions, getting out of the press room can often get you a better story. But there is kind of a mentality there that you got to be in the press room, the White House, the main press corps. How do you break that?
Well, first of all, as Canadian journalists there, not just CBC, but out-of-towners, we don't depend very much on that kind of access. To some people, that is what access journalism is, that they go and they are handed, under earlier administrations, they would be handed a story of the day, or they would at least get, the president's point of view on whatever the issue of the day was. And it's not like there's no value in that. But there's less value in that than there ever has been, as far as I can see. It's become far more combative among the so-called mainstream media and the legacy media. But the other thing that's happening there is that other media who were not even part of the White House press corps are now shaping the message that gets out of there. There's a lot of very conservative media or small outlets that are asking questions that are in some ways distractions from what the mainstream media wants to talk about. So the whole nature of what goes on in the White House press briefing has changed. But what's changing, I think, in the most important way is what journalists are doing to overcome the fact that they are no longer working in the same environment that they had grown used to over many, many decades. That has meant that they are cultivating sources farther away from the White House, looking for stories that are farther away from the bubble of Washington. This is actually something that we have been doing for a long, long time because we never had the access in the first place. And I think during the election campaign, and particularly during the primary season, we actually did journalism that was ahead of the curve in terms of what was being reported by American media. My producer and team and I went out and did some stories which I think are the stories I'm most proud of, because they identified trends that were happening in the hinterland. The hinterland was what Trump was all about. That's where that story was happening. It wasn't happening inside the Beltway. And we were used to dealing with that. We were used to looking for stories that weren't going to depend on us, for instance, having access to the Secretary of State, which is never going to happen, right? So we would look for our experts somewhere else and our real people somewhere else, and that's the way we would do it. But I think a large part of the Trump story right now is this story of media relations. It's an important moment for journalism in the United States, and I think, you know, I could go on and on and on and on and on if you want me to, but I think it's very important to watch.
No, you couldn't go on and on. But, you know, listen, in some ways, this has been the best thing that's happened to journalism, especially in the United States, and especially political reporting. Some of the best political reporting we've seen, you know, in the last, well, since Watergate, is happening around this story. And at a time when, especially on the print side of journalism, there was a real fear that print was almost going out of business, and they were, certainly in some papers. But you've seen this resurgence. You see circulation up at the New York Times, up at the Washington Post, up at the Wall Street Journalism. Why? Because they're doing great journalism. So it's kind of the irony of this, the way this is playing out.
Can I add also that, you know, I think there is some truth to the idea that the administrative state, that entrenched Washington elite, is leaking like it's never leaked before to a media that it believes is the only way that it can get its story out now, because its story is being suppressed for whatever reasons by an administration that doesn't want that kind of scrutiny and criticism. The Washington Post and the New York Times are in a league of their own now in getting those leaks and working those sources, and I don't see any reason why this is going to stop.
All right, question here in the audience, right over here, sir.
Clive Schwartz, I have a personal question of each of you. Can you give examples of the challenges you face separating the emotional attachment or how situations tear at your heartstrings or incense you while maintaining your professionalism and objectivity?
All right, great question. I'm going to ask Margaret to handle it, because I want you to watch something that Margaret did just a couple of weeks ago in South Sudan that had a huge impact on anyone who saw it, and we want to know the impact it had on her doing it, which I think is your question. Watch this.
Each time a flight passes, they're dropping enough food to feed 1,500 people for 1 month. 7 passes today.
But the conflict shifts from place to place like a disaffected suitor. The whole country is hurting. This is what starvation looks like in the capital, Juba. Teresa is so critical, she needs a feeding tube, still dressed in her best for her trip to the hospital. 4-year-old Bak also has acute malnutrition and tuberculosis on top of that. There is no money for his treatment. Shriven bodies with old souls are everywhere you look, the ward overflowing. Some children on the ground outside, hovering between a beginning or an end. 4-year-old Bak died 2 days after we met him, disappearing from sight like those people in the bush, waiting for a peace that may never come. Margaret Evans, CBC News, in Unity State, South Sudan.
So, how do you deal with that?
Well, not well, apparently, because you look at the images and it comes back to you. But that, it's something that I kind of grappled with early on in my career. And I've actually had to remind myself a little bit in the wake of South Sudan, because those kids, you know, you look them in the eye, you lock eyes, you know, with these little boys who were dead a few days later. You lock eyes with their mothers who, you know, are stricken and sometimes look ashamed because their kids are perishing in front of them. And it's difficult to, they dance in my head. But that's what they're supposed to do on a certain level. And this is sort of how I deal with it anyway. I think everybody has their own ways. But, I covered an earthquake in Turkey, like in 1999. And, the buildings kind of accordion in on themselves. And it's such an odd, surreal thing because half a building strips away and, there are shoes and photo albums flying around and floor upon floor. And there was a man, he was in his 70s, and he was, this was in Turkey, waiting while the rescue workers were trying to pull out the body of his elderly sister. And they were tugging on her arm, and she was kind of between levels, and they tugged and they tugged, and her body came out. It kind of hovered in the air and then landed with a thud. And there's a great gasp, and I just couldn't get that image out of my head. And it wasn't until I stopped trying to that I felt okay. And again, I'll be the journalist of cliche up here, but that's what we're here to do. We're here to bear witness. We're there to go and see. We're there to remember them. I worry about having caused, Bach in particular, the little 4-year-old boy, distress because we were big and they don't see that many white people, these kids, and I felt like we were frightening him, and that really haunts me too. But if you don't show those kids, you don't know what's happening, and you can't save the next kid. And all of that helps when you're trying to deal with, some of the stuff that you see.
Nola?
No, Margaret's exactly right. I think the only thing that helps balance what are obviously very human reactions that we have in the field to certain situations is the fact that we do get to tell the story. The fact that we share that story with you and with all of our audiences. Because that, in a way, it's an action. Yet when you see someone who's lying there, and you see someone who's in the most intimate moment of their life, in a sea, for example, where I saw them trying to be saved and getting onto a ship or walking across Europe. I mean, it's a very intrusive process that we're involved in. We're barging into these people's lives, and I do feel like I owe something. I owe telling a story to someone else. And so that helps me balance my own feelings about what I see on the ground. And what's important too, I should say, just in the practical sense of dealing with these situations, is that thankfully, at least maybe not for Sasha, but many of us travel in teams. And we are our family, our doctor, our teacher. In those little situations, we're always take care of each other, the threes or the twos that we travel together. So that helps, of course, balance not just what you write, because someone else is reading it and telling you if you're going too far, but also helps you maybe at the end of the night have a little chat.
If you are doing this by yourself, as I am too, and I'm often shooting these things as well as reporting on them, and I remember one situation years ago when I was covering the tsunami in Thailand after the earthquake there, and there was a Canadian team that was actually doing an autopsy on one of the bodies. And it's not like Canada. Basically, they were pulling out the bodies, and they were right there, and I was right there with my camera. And you smell it, you feel it, you see what's there in front of you. You have to capture it because that's the only way to get some of this across. You have to capture it, of course, in a certain way that tells the story without being unnecessarily gruesome. But from my perspective, when things were sort of the toughest, the fact that I was looking through the camera allowed me, in a way, I was watching it on TV, and it allowed me to get just enough distance to be able to continue doing that job and telling the story, when in fact, as I say, you're watching, somebody's actually being cut open in order to find out what happened.
Just on Sasha's point, I also work often as a team of one, and I remember specifically when I was covering the shooting in San Bernardino, emotions being very raw there, and I happened to be invited to the home of of the family of one of the 14 victims, Tin Nguyen. She was a 31-year-old public health inspector at San Bernardino. And this is hours after the family themselves had learned that that their cousin, their sister, their daughter was among one of the victims. And these things, I find sometimes they don't hit you until after. I sort of almost feel like I had kind of like almost tunnel vision just to do the job and to sort of honor this person by telling her story. But I remember it wasn't until I got back to the hotel and sort of just had time to decompress. And that's when you start to get emotional, when you have time to yourself. And in those types of moments, I call someone I love, which is what I'm sure many of you do as well.
A couple of things that I can add to that. I remember in 9/11, all of us do, obviously. I'd been on the air for many hours, and finally got a break around 4 o'clock the morning after, and the little message light was blinking on my phone in my office, and I checked it because it's basically a private line. I checked it was my daughter. It was one of my daughters in Winnipeg, and so I called her and I said, "Hi, what's up?" And she said, "Just want to know I love you." So it's kind of the same thing. And for me that night, it made me connect that whole story in a way I hadn't thought of. I'd been so busy on the air, I knew, obviously I knew the scope of things and how, what a disaster it was and what it could possibly lead to, but I hadn't sensed the impact it was having on people everywhere, that they wanted to connect with family, wherever that family was, that it was important for them to touch base. And so the story took on a whole new level I hadn't thought of. That's one. The other point I just want to make, because I don't want anybody here in the audience or those online to think that we use pictures gratuitously, because we do not. If we wanted to, we could fill a newscast every day with awful pictures. They're available from any number of places in the world and in our own country through traffic accidents or fires or what have you. So, this whole sense that, if it bleeds, it leads on television news or in any newscast is totally unfair to the kind of people who are making decisions every day. But some of those decisions are tough. I'll never forget the day that one of our greatest correspondents, Joe Schlesinger, who's here tonight, but was covering the Civil War in El Salvador. He'd sent an item to us that was filled with brutality between the two sides, the government forces and the guerrilla forces. And some of the pictures were really, I won't describe them now, but they were really, really difficult to look at. And Joe, as often he did, sent this in right on the border line in terms of making it in time for the show, so we wouldn't fiddle around with it. But we said, we said, Joe, some of these pictures, they're just too difficult to look at. And he got mad at us. And he said, look, sometimes you've got to show what it's really like. He said, I've been down here covering this. I know you're all getting tired of this war, but it's a brutal war. And it's leading people to do incredible, awful, inhumane things to each other. And sometimes you just have to show it. And Joe, as he always did, made a convincing argument. We ran the pictures. Nobody phoned us to say, hey, great item. Thank you for showing us those pictures. Nobody did that. Instead, we got lots of calls and mail, that thing you used to put in a box, and complaints about that item. But you know what? Nobody who saw it will ever forget it. It had its impact. Now, you can't do that every day. You can't do that on every conflict. But sometimes you have to make that decision. But I want you to be assured that when we put a warning up, as we often do, and I think we did on some of Margaret's footage from South Sudan, We do it for a reason, but it is going to be difficult to watch. But we've made a decision that we think you need to see this. But believe me, there's always a lot more that we could have shown. A question from the audience, and it is, where? Right over here. Yes, sir.
David Rosenbaum. My question is for Sasha Petrusek. You were recently in North Korea, and I understand that journalists who are reporting from North Korea have to have government minders with them. Did you have a government minder with you? What was that like? And did you feel that you needed to censor yourself in any way? And if you did, what's the true story?
Yes, definitely. Basically, the ground rules are, first of all, it's harder to get into North Korea as a journalist than as a private citizen. There are actually tours that you can take if you go through China as a private citizen, and you can get into North Korea. Not so with journalists. You have to be given a rare visa, which comes with a certain number of understandings or conditions, if you like. And one of them is that basically you are their guest, and yes, you have a government minder, which is usually a nice enough government employee who follows you around. But he does more than that. He also is, they basically put you in buses. You don't get out of the hotel unless they are taking you somewhere. They have a very specific set of things they want to show you. Some of them are large-scale events. Some of you may have seen them with, tanks and missiles and things going across a big square. Other things are more supposed to show you the, daily life as they would like you to see it. But in all of these cases, you have to, you interview people who are in front of you. Now, until very recently, they actually limited who you could interview. You weren't allowed to talk to average North Koreans. When I was there, you actually were allowed to. They did allow us to do that.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me just show part of the report I think you were leading to so people have an understanding. Watch this.
Deep under Pyongyang, people pour out of the subway. They look bored or weary, but there's no sign of panic. Under the gaze of their so-called dear leaders, previous rulers of North Korea in the Kim dynasty, in huge murals, it's clear the party line has been learned. The U.S. imperialists may try to crush us, says Lee Se-hee, but the revolution will prevail, and North and South Korea will unite under our current leader, Kim Jong-un. Children practice their instruments after school. Families swim as they do every Sunday. It's almost as if no one is threatening a nuclear war here. And yet, on the parade ground, that's exactly what one of Kim Jong-un's top advisors predicts, almost poetically. It's the joyful sound of a hydrogen bomb exploding, he says, made by the strongest nuclear power in the East. As you can see there, I did talk to people. The translator was my minder. Now, I don't speak Korean, so I had to take his word for it, at least in the first instance, of what the people were saying. However, what I did was I took the audio from that, I sent it to someone I trusted in South Korea, who then translated it for me. And the answer was that yes, the people that we talked to did know the party line, more or less, but it was embellished. It was added to by the minder. It wasn't exactly the translation that he gave me. And so we obviously have to check these things to the best of our ability. Does that make me censor myself? No, I don't censor myself. I don't go out of my way to antagonize the people that I'm there that would stop me from, continuing to report. But at the end of the day, the ground rules do not give them control over what I report or what I show. They can try to prevent me from seeing things, from shooting things, from talking to certain people, but that report is exactly the way that I would have wanted to write it. They did not see it before it was broadcast. And I think we got a pretty accurate picture, at least of what we saw. Is that daily life? Is that real life? The people in the subway and the ones swimming? It's a part of real life. Some people do that, but there's large parts of North Korea that you do not see and cannot see, and it just means we'll have to go back.
Yeah, all right. Nala.
I too was very lucky, or just a chance to see what a place like North Korea was like a year ago. And what really struck me is that the minders weren't just with you every day, but they slept in your hotel. They literally, you could not walk out of the hotel. Not in your room, no, but in the hotel. But what I was going to say, just to add to that, is that I wanted to talk to people, and we know they exist, who don't support the regime and who do not want to live under the rules that are imposed on them. And so we did a bit of gathering, talking to people, and obviously lots of visuals. And what we tried to do to balance what we got is when we left, there are actually defectors who live in the UK. So we actually made contact with a defector, interviewed them, spoke to a couple of experts who travel regularly to North Korea, but not just to Pyongyang as most of us get to, but beyond to the countryside, who meet all sorts of other people. So, and then we wrote a piece. We didn't do a TV piece, but we wrote a piece that kind of looked at a bigger picture and tried to get beyond some of the challenges that you have obviously on the ground there.
And obviously, just from being there, you actually observe things, you can describe things, and that's one of the reasons for actually going, as opposed to simply taking somebody else's word for it. There's diplomats, there's NGO workers, and as Nala says, there are so-called dissidents who have fled North Korea, who are in South Korea or elsewhere in the world, and they'll tell you their story. But by being there, by going there, you can add to it, because you can get that sense of what life is like. And it's really quite eerie in that place. You do get a sense that everything is controlled. Very hard to do that without actually standing in that subway station or even during those parades.
And you know, Sasha's minder is also still with him, actually, still follows him. It's just in the back. Margaret wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it also depends on what country you're in, of course. So you have varying degrees of control. You know, recently came back from Syria, where it was pretty strict. But you also develop relationships with your fixers, or not your fixers, sorry, your minders. Your fixers are helping you, your minders are minding you. But one of the most successful minders of all time I've ever experienced was a guy in Libya. This was before the fall of Gaddafi. And he just seemed so bumbling, you know, kind of a Monsieur Clouseau kind of guy. And because you do have to take them everywhere, and you are sharing hotels and all the rest of it, and buying their meals every day, and going, well, you know, is our interview request in, or we want to film the guys printing the posters of Gaddafi, who designed the African hat, you know, that sort of stuff. And he just seemed so incompetent. He just ran down the clock. So, you know, we didn't get any of the interviews that we'd wanted to. I mean, yeah, it was good you're there. You still kind of managed to talk to people. I just wanted to say, you know, you actually you meet a lot of characters out there too, and you get to know their habits, what time they go to bed, when you might be able to slip out of the hotel. Are they really sleeping, or are they really watching you? It can be quite a complex relationship.
All right, we want moving on here for another question. Emily Wynn asks, what differences are you making by interviewing people about their personal experiences? You know, when you're in another country, you're trying to explain what can be a major international issue. By interviewing sort of ordinary people and gaining their experiences, what does that help us with? Neil?
There are a lot of misconceptions about countries like Turkey, and so when you speak to so-called ordinary people, you're getting the real story. It's not, you know, what a politician wants you to hear about the country, or what someone opposed to that politician wants you to hear. You're hearing their own experiences. So, yeah, when we talk about sources, you know, we can't get official sources anymore. You know, in Turkey, it's just better to speak to the average people who will talk to you. That's where you'll get the real story for people who feel comfortable speaking up. That's where the real story is. It's no question. Of course, there are times we have to speak to officials to get the official party line, but after a point, you know what they're going to say anyway. what they're going to like and what they're not going to like. So I'd much rather speak to people, no matter what country you're in, to speak to the person on the street, the person who's living the issues.
And if you speak to enough people, this is the other advantage of being there. You know, you see in our stories, you see one clip, let's say, of somebody, and you say, okay, well, that's that person's opinion. Why am I including that in a story? The point is that we speak to a lot of people, and we speak to them a lot more than what you see. As Nala said earlier, these are often long interviews. We get their whole life story sometimes. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. And what we choose to air is usually what we feel is representative of what's really on their minds, what many people are thinking. It's just that person happens to have expressed it best.
And that's another reason why just relying on wire services isn't enough. They can be really helpful when we can't get somewhere, and Reuters is great, and they'll get man on the street, woman on the street clips, but they haven't done a 45-minute interview with someone to get that impact. Or we don't know if they have, right? Or you're relying on their selection, which isn't always necessarily representative of the whole situation as a whole.
All right. Let me ask this question of both Matt and Keith. It's about the situation in the States. It's about the White House. It's about Trump. We've been getting a lot of questions. So if the Trump agenda is kind of taking over the news agenda, why not just stop reporting on it for a while? We actually have that debate around the news desk at times. Are we doing too much Trump? Should we back off a bit? So that discussion does take place. But this question related to that is more focused. Ayesha Raja Kadri asks, Matt and Keith, is your head spinning from all the news coming from the White House? Matt, what do you say?
Absolutely. I mean, this month, May, the first couple weeks of May have been totally nuts. News has been breaking after we filed stories, and I'm at home making dinner, news is breaking. And you're filing another story. The stories are getting so complicated that for me to write a follow-up to the previous day's story, I literally I have to sit there it's almost like trying to put a puzzle together. How do you explain the three major news stories that just happened in the last two days? I don't know, should I even try to do it now? I mean, Donald Trump fires his FBI director. A report that the FBI director was pressured by the president to stop an investigation. And then, add on top of that, maybe the president also leaked some classified info to the Russians. But that's not even the story. That's just the background to the story. How do you, when you only have a certain amount of real estate in an actual written piece before people lose interest, but you have to still explain all that context, it's really quite complicated.
Yeah, Matt and I and Paul and Lindsay, we're living in dog years. You think that Trump has only been in power for about 4 months? For us, it's been about 4 years, just because of the quantity of news that's made all the time. You're talking about the Comey thing. You don't even get to the part where he totally betrays his communication staff by going off message. He's the president. He is the message, right? So if you're doing that story and you don't get to that point in the day, your story is going to actually be wrong. It's not something you can go back the next day and fix it. It is now way, way farther down the track than it was before. And this happens to us every week, maybe 3 or 4 times a week.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like it, but I wouldn't want to be covering any other story right now.
Question in the audience, right here.
Hi there, Carmen Schultz. I just have a question in regards to the world we live in today, where we get news at all times of day, everything's going on, and there are multiple news stories. What criteria do you use to decide what stories you're going to tell?
Yeah, well, the lineup editor isn't here to make his and her case, depending on which night it is. But, part of the decision-making process is in the pitches and the arguments that the journalists make from the field about what they think is important for us to be telling. And, you know, so perhaps the best way to handle this question is to ask, well, let me start with Noah, about a story that you felt that you really had to fight for when you were dealing with the desk. We use that term, the desk, here in Toronto is the foreign editor, the foreign lineup editor, the assignment editor, the writers, sometimes the anchor. Making the case about the story that they think is really important that we must cover. Give us an example of that kind of back and forth that goes on.
Well, I mean, essentially it happens on every story, because if you really wanted to cover the world, I mean, you couldn't possibly get all those stories on air. But it starts with an idea, and it can start from a producer or from a reporter or from someone in the bureau where we are in London. And then our former foreign editor who's in the crowd, Brian Christie, used to call it pushing a rock up a hill. It's like Sisyphus, you know, he's constantly pushing up and trying to get past a number of people, a number of very smart people who read, who know what's happening in the world, that your story is far more important and far more interesting and worthy of your tax dollars spending to actually go and cover. So it's not an easy process. I can't just call up and say, well, today I'd like to go cover this. It's a process that we all participate in. It's a group effort. And obviously, too, we have to find out about logistics, whether it's doable or not. I mean, I should say that bit of tape that you saw earlier was an hour on the ground, actually talking to these asylum seekers. The rest of that day was driving in a massive black van for 8 hours from the Hungarian border all the way to the Croatian border. So again, like, is that a good use of our time? Well, that day we decided it was, and we got a story of people walking through cornfields to try to find a better life. So it's a difficult process, but it's a rewarding one, because often our people do trust us, and they trust our eyes on the world, and they want to know what we think. So we tell them, and we push really hard.
And sometimes, like, I live in a place where we're 12 hours off from the time zone here in Canada, and you can use it. Usually that's a pain in the neck, but sometimes you can use that to your advantage. I was back in Nepal for the 1-year anniversary of the earthquake last year, and the desk very much wanted me to limit the amount of time that I was on the ground. Of course, every minute that's on the ground every day, it costs more money, but I knew there was one more thing I had to go check. Well, most of the desk is sleeping in the night here, but in the daytime there, you can go and actually report things. So I did go out. I went out to the valley just outside of Kathmandu, and it was a brickyard. And what I found there were 7-, 8-, and 9-year-olds working in the brickyard. And this was a clear example of what was happening there, which is that after the earthquake, one of the big problems was in child trafficking and using children to do things that they weren't supposed to do. This was not a story that was out there. It was not a story that was easy to sort of find examples of out on the streets necessarily in Kathmandu. You had to actually go to specific places. And so I took the hours that my editors were sleeping here to take advantage of that and actually get, I think, one of the most compelling stories about what had happened as a result of that earthquake in that country.
All right, I've got to move it on here because we're into the home stretch here, and there are lots of questions piling up. So if I can ask people to keep their answers relatively short, and to the moderator to just shut up and ask the questions. Margaret, here's one for you. Megan Abbey asks, when you land in a foreign place and have to share a critical and developing event, what are your first steps in identifying the best story to tell?
Well, like everything, I mean, sounds like a cop-out answer, but it depends on the story that you're going to cover. You have an idea of what you're going to cover, but you're landing in very different environments. I mean, South Sudan's a good example because we did a lot of planning to get there. Stephanie Genzer was a producer on the trip. She's probably somewhere in the audience. I just don't see her. And Richard Devey, okay, she's over there, was our camera editor. And we knew we needed to get to the famine area. That's not easy. You land in a chaotic airport. You have to depend on aid agencies to get anywhere. Can you get on the flight? Almost one of the most difficult things we did every day was line up to try to get on these humanitarian flights out of Juba. The conflict would move from zone to zone, so we were relying on aid agencies to help because sometimes you have to sleep behind their doors and stuff like that. That's very different than getting to Damascus. You're picking up your minder and driving all the way to Aleppo. So it's a difficult question to answer. But you talk to people and you try to do your homework beforehand, and that's where our producers are so valuable because they can do that while we're doing the rest of the work.
All right, Hillary has a question for us around here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Chris Sue, and I would like an example of a time that you wish you had done something differently from how you told the story or the perspective that you gave.
Well, that's a good one, of course. Some of us have never thought we'd... I think we've all been there at some point. Who wants to try that one? Keith?
I think the story of Ferguson. I was there as a very small unit for a number of days, and we followed the puck. What that means is that we were doing the news of the day and trying to figure out what was going on day by day, but working towards some kind of a thinky piece that would put it into a different context. And we did that, and I thought that the piece was fine. But because of what has happened since, I think that the piece would not stand up very well in the context of trying to understand Black Lives Matter, the sense that the African American community exists as a colony within the United States, not as a part of the United States. And that's a reflection of how much more that I have learned and continue to learn about the story. So I said earlier in covering Trump that, I'd done some of the work that I'm most proud of. I would not put that story on my list.
All right.
It's something I lose sleep over. You have a minute 45, if you're lucky, to 2 minutes and 30 seconds for some of these stories. And most stories are not black and white, especially somewhere like Turkey. It's not just, one side is good, one side is bad. There's a lot of nuance that you have to tell. And when it's a place you haven't covered a lot, or Canadians haven't been exposed to a lot in recent years, there's a lot of explaining to do. So you do go home at night a lot of the time and say, should I have used that clip? Should I have said that line? Should we have made that cut? That's where, even though it's a lot harder in terms of our coverage to be filing for all the platforms, at least in my experience, that's lifted a little bit of the sleeplessness, because you can put something in a lot more in the online piece that you couldn't put in the TV piece, that you had to leave on the cutting room floor. The radio piece allows you to do different things with the story as well. So that's alleviated some of the guilt, but we have to make really hard decisions every day, every story. And it's not because the lineup editor doesn't think those stories are important. Limited real estate is the phrase, we use a lot. Matt used it earlier tonight. So they're really tough decisions.
And it's good, as we all do at times, to second guess yourself, but there's a limit to how far you can do that, especially in the kind of business we're in, where the next day is approaching fast, and you've got new challenges because of that. An old lineup editor of ours, Mark Bulgich, who I think is actually here tonight, Mark, he used to say, there's no computer at the end of the day. You can take your decisions and put them in, and out will pop something saying, you were right on every call you made, or you were wrong on every call you made. These are like human decisions that are made by people, no different than you, who have been lucky enough to be at the site of a story, and they're trying to tell the story to those who want to hear about it. And, there are different ways to tell stories. And some of these people here, and certainly some as well who are gathered here at the other correspondents, are so tough on themselves about constantly challenging the way they told stories, and wondering whether it could have been, better if I'd been able to include that line or that clip, or if I hadn't done this or hadn't done that. When at the end of the day, their work is pretty incredible, and it's world class. And I don't just say that, because I'm here at the CBC. Okay, we have another question in the audience right here.
Karen Bliss. Everyone here presumably are news junkies, everyone watching, but I actually have friends who refuse to watch the news. They don't want to know about bad news, they don't want to see it, and unfortunately, that's not unusual. There are a lot of people like that. I try and explain why it's important to know what's going on in the rest of the world. What would you say to people like that?
I ask each of the correspondents to give us one line on why it's important to understand what's happening on the other side of the world.
One line. That's
Yeah.
so mean, Peter.
I'm trying.
I've already used up my line.
That's your line next.
It's important to be informed, but I would say because we're inundated from so many sources, and you choose your sources carefully. You don't need to be watching 24 hours a day, but if you choose your sources carefully, because we feel the same way in this current environment too, I think, with Trump, in Turkey as well. Sometimes I don't turn on the TV, but I'm still consuming information from reliable sources. So sticking your head in the sand doesn't solve the problem.
Ma'am?
Here's my line. I'll give a little bit of preamble first, before the line. Bit of a teaser. No, I was talking to an evangelical pastor in Alabama about why Canadians would care about what happens in the United States. Why would I care to know what's happening in his state? And the line we eventually settled on, which he said to me was, well, I suppose you would want to know if your neighbor's house was on fire.
Sasha, one line.
I think as living in a democracy, I think when we make decisions and we choose our leaders, we choose what our leaders do in a sense, we should be informed. And I think we have a responsibility to be informed, to know what's going on in our backyard, to our neighbors, and to the people on the other side of the world. When people aren't informed and they vote, then you end up perhaps with the kind of disasters that happen, say, in the United States, perhaps.
Margaret.
Knowledge is power. It is one of the great equalizers that we have. That's it.
Nala.
I would say no country is an island, and that includes Canada. The whole world it's interdependent, and we all need to know each other's stories. We're all the same, and we need to learn from each other's experiences.
Keith.
Trying to punctuate my sentence so that just saying one.
So it's all one.
Yeah. So I think the Trump election taught us two things, : one, I think, is the familiar lesson that a lot of people learned, that if they weren't paying attention to what was going on and they didn't get involved, that elections have consequences, and the result may not have been what they wanted. But there was a lesson, and I think we should not be self-righteous about this. There was a lesson for us, too, in not following everything that was going on in the country. We missed a big part of the Trump story because we thought we were well enough informed about what was happening in America, and we just weren't. Period.
Okay. Good. Nicholas Zandrowski asks this, and I think Nala, given your Iranian experience, this is a good one. How has cybersecurity concerns changed the way you communicate with sources abroad?
In my Iranian experience, well, I mean, one way to start that answer is by saying that when we go to a country like Iran or North Korea or other places, China, we do go through a process, an informal one, in which we make sure that our electronic devices don't include any sources that I normally have on there. I have, I think, about 1,000 phone numbers on this phone, which I take everywhere. And I don't take those to places I go to. Often we'll take a brand new computer. So hard drives actually are confiscated at the Pyongyang airport, so they don't like those, or USBs, so generally tend to leave those away. in terms of communication, we sometimes will use different email addresses. We have several, like as we talked about for security purposes, passports. Sometimes you have to travel to different places, so email addresses. We just try to ensure that whatever information we own is not vulnerable in a place like those countries. So that's one way to protect it.
I think that's, and in a place like China, first of all, you assume that everything is susceptible to being listened to or to being hacked in one form or another. You have to use a VPN in order to even communicate. I can't access my email without a VPN. I can't see the CBC website. It's blocked in China. And if something is really sensitive, then I guess you use a certain amount of encryption when you're sending stuff. And we have the ability to do that too. Does that protect everything and everybody? No, but you hope that your secrets will slip through the cracks.
Have any of you ever been threatened? Outright threatened in trying to do your story, trying to do your job?
I'm sure. No, not specifically threatened, but certainly in crowd scenes. We've all been in scenes where we've been faced with the line of riot police. South Sudan, not South Sudan, Sudan proper, sorry, before there was a South Sudan, in the days of Darfur, pulled in by government, pulled into jail, basically. But not, I don't know why I'm talking since the answer is no.
No?
Sometimes it's not a direct threat. I will do this to you, but by labeling you a certain way, in some countries, the go-to is you're a spy, you're a foreign agent. Not just fake news. Like, they'll call you a spy, and there are people who will believe that. So there's always the concern, will someone take that a step further? Will someone believe that you actually are? That's the kind of threat that you feel sometimes.
Sasha?
Once in Afghanistan, and I was interviewing the family of a taxi driver who had been shot by Canadian forces. You may remember that story years ago. And sitting on the floor in his family's house, and they were looking for restitution from the or compensation from the Canadian government. And they were getting very frustrated because the Canadian government wasn't responding, and I was there interviewing them, and I could see them getting more and more frustrated. And the one person who spoke English in the room finally turned to me and says, "My uncle says you're not really understanding this. You seem to think that we're all terrorists here. If we were terrorists, we could just kill you right now." So there was the threat.
No?
Again, like Margaret, it's mostly, not that this makes it any better, but it's mostly been physical threats. The one that comes to mind, I think, Margaret, you were there, I can't remember now, but we were in a car driving back to our hotel during the uprising in Cairo, and we came across a mob who didn't like the look of us, and essentially were saying to us in the car, which one do we kill first, and why are you here, and those kinds of things. And thankfully, one of the few situations where I say thankfully when a soldier shows up, there were Egyptian soldiers nearby who came and saved us from that situation, and we were able to walk back to our hotel.
I'd say that was a threat.
I actually do remember a threat now.
Okay.
Now that I thought I've had some time to think about it. I was actually doing a story in Hungary last fall, and we were trying to get at the far right there, and we had to go through a lot of, we were being interviewed by these guys because you'd go and hope that they would talk to you, but they've become very sophisticated, and they'd sort of say, come in and you can sign this legal document which says we have the right to kind of edit your piece and change things, But these are hard guys, and going down in the elevator after, we keep thinking we're going to be able to convince them, didn't, and then we say, thank you, no, we can't agree to that, but going down in the elevator, this fellow said, I've got friends in Canada, I've got friends in Hell's Angel, and if anything that comes out of this conversation is reported, we're going to them. Now, for us, that's fine. I actually said to him, I know a threat when I hear one. And no, that's not, but for us, it's not a problem. But for our translator, it was a big deal. And that we face that a lot, that, we fly in and out, we have the passports, we have embassy support a lot of the time. The people we rely on to help us do our job don't. And so you try to do what you can, keep in touch, try to not do anything that jeopardizes their safety. But I remember that clearly. And he did have our translator some scary emails from the guy.
All right. A couple of questions left in the room, and one is right here.
Hi, my name is Claire Slaughter, and I'm curious to know how important, or rather how top of mind, is the Canadian identity while you're reporting internationally? If this is the case, how do you use it to differentiate your story from something we may see in the American media sphere?
All right. How do we put a Canadian, I was going to say spin, but that's not the right word, a Canadian lens on these stories that we're covering? Matt, how do you do that?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that I think it's important that Canadians are telling these stories in the first place, because there's clearly a craving from Canadian audiences to know about what's happening in the US. We can't go out there and sort of presume that Canadians are following what's happening in Washington or anywhere else as breathlessly as anybody else in the US may be. So I think there's value there to sort of going the extra step to sort of adding context, explaining what is an executive order, explaining kind of how the impeachment process works. And that may not be exactly sort of a Canadian, angle to the story, but it's serving a Canadian audience, I think.
And I think people are also craving the way we, specifically at CBC, tell stories, the kind of context you talked about. Where I'm working, I've seen the progression, what happens when there isn't unbiased journalism. People on both sides have their message, and that's the message they're telling. So people can't get an unbiased report from any newspaper. So they stick to the side that they agree with. We see that in the United States as well. So people are craving the kinds of storytelling that I think specifically CBC offers. So it's not necessarily you go into Istanbul or you go into DC and try to find a Canadian voice always. Sometimes you do, but it's just the way we're telling the story that can help.
And I'd also I found it interesting. I've gotten a couple of emails before from people who are not Canadians who follow the CBC's online coverage and actually also our broadcast coverage. And they specifically note in their emails to me that they like following us because they want an unfiltered view of what's happening in their own country.
I'd like to add something too, is that
Sure.
maybe it's not something we do consciously. I'm not going to say this is actually in my mind when we're reporting, but if you look at the larger picture of Canadians versus Americans or British covering some parts of the world, for one, Canada does not have a colonial history outside, of colonizing a country in the Middle East or in Africa. Those kinds of things, big picture things that us as Canadians are just part of our makeup, influence the way we look at the world as opposed to how others see the world. So that's one important point.
Have you ever got a story because you are Canadian? Like given the benefit of additional information because you are Canadian?
Well, I'd like to think, and I was told at the time that we got an interview with the president of Iraq at the time because we were Canadian and not American. That was one example.
There are examples, though, where we think we have this reputation of being honest brokers, but I have to say that reporting in the Middle East, in the West Bank, during the Harper administration, when Canada was making it clearer that we were perhaps friendlier with Israel than with the Palestinians, at least that was the way it was being perceived there, people were starting to get, I was starting to get dirty looks because of that at the time, because that message was getting out. That may not be the way that Canadians perceive themselves, but suddenly we were being perceived as taking sides in something that was very close to their hearts.
More and more Canada is getting swept up, at least in Turkey as well, in that general anti-West sentiment. It used to be people really loved Canada, and there's still that group. Many of them want to move here or planning to move here, but more and more, they lump us into the same group. You don't understand us. You only come here when something explodes. You don't really understand. So that's why it's another reason why it's important to be there and cover beyond, terror attacks, cover what people are living through.
Can I ask one short snapper? I've asked this at most of these forums across the country. I want you to tell me, and many of you go into some pretty, in some cases exotic, and in some places extremely dangerous places. Tell us one thing that you take with you on these trips that might surprise us. When I asked Ormiston this a couple of weeks ago, she said, "Oh, mascara." Why not? Keith?
Mascara.
Well, in Washington, you need...
Oh, but you travel. You travel as well. And
I always make sure that I have a way of just withdrawing from the day when I want to. Usually, it's a book, and not a book about what I'm working on right now, but a book that I can sit back and enjoy for 20 minutes. I find that important.
Margaret.
I can't answer that question. Nothing would surprise you. I take my contact lenses, my asthma medication. I'm a very good packer. When I come back, especially when I come back to Canada, I'm more problematic, and my sister will tell you, I always come back without adapters. I have no Canadian adapters, and I'll want to have my hair cut. That's what she would tell you. So it's kind of the reverse for me,
I've never had that problem.
No.
Matt?
Probably fruit. If you're ever at a hotel and you see me and the fruit bowl at the breakfast kiosk or little breakfast place is missing fruit, it's because I've taken all the fruit because I eat terribly while I'm on the road, and I just sometimes just want to drive and just grab a banana or something like that.
Okay. Nolan.
I'm really boring as well. I guess I'll mention that I always take gym gear and a swimsuit, but the surprising part perhaps is that I never, ever get to use either of them.
She's actually and she always takes a little thing of tea. Like if you want a hot cup of tea, Nala's the door to knock on.
And Gordon Lightfoot.
Yeah.
Right. Great. Sasha, what you taking to North Korea that'll surprise
I would
us?
say, running shoes. I've run in some of the strangest places that you can imagine in the world, and you got to have running shoes.
I always get mocked for having such a heavy bag, but reporters like me are the ones you want with you because I'm always prepared for anything. But the thing I have to have is a snack, usually chocolate, because a hangry reporter, at least a hangry Neil, is not one you want to hang out with, not one you want to get a report from.
All right, last question of the evening, and it comes from... This is a fix.
Long-time listener, first-time caller. I think it's about time we turned a couple of questions onto Mansbridge. So
No.
one of them's an anecdote, and it was about a little over 8 years ago that you came to D.C. and you scored a mega interview. You had a sit-down with Barack Obama. And it was such a big deal that afterwards, Peter came back to the bureau and you sat down and you got CNN, Wolf Blitzer wanted to talk to him, just ask him, what was it like? What did he say? It was a monster. So I kind of want to know what was going through your head, sitting in the White House as Barack Obama walked in and sit down and talk to you. But more broadly, and in a classic sort of, you go to any news conference and the one guarantee is going to be that the person before you asks the question you were going to ask. And so I want to steal from the one that was asking everybody else about maintaining your Canadian sensibility, but I want to hear from Peter on that. Advice to the veteran journalists on the stage and younger journalists like myself about the importance of that and how to maintain your Canadian sensibility reporting on major stories around the world and really the value in that. So I throw it to you.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. All right. Thank you, Paul. I'll tell you a quick story about Obama. It was a big deal for us. It was, the first time that I'd had an interview with a a U.S. president while in office. In fact, I think it was the first time the CBC had ever had a one-on-one with a U.S. president. He'd just taken office. He'd only been there a month. So it was a big deal. We didn't get a lot of time with him. I think it was 12 minutes or something it ended up being. And they were in a real rush to move him along because he had to fly out to the western United States somewhere, so the helicopter was waiting on the pad outside. So they bring him in. It was in the map room of the White House, right on the main floor. He walks in, has his arm out. He says, "Peter, welcome to the White House. Great to have you here." I'm going, "Jeez, this is great." You know? The guy obviously must watch us online every night. You know? So he sits down, and we, do a little small talk while they're setting up the mics and everything, and that was all very nice. And then we get into the interview, and it was bang, bang, bang. There was all the things you'd expect: Afghanistan, the economy. There was stuff about the oil sands. There was a variety of different questions, and he showed a remarkable knowledge of Canada, and he'd obviously been properly briefed on some of these issues. Then suddenly, it was over, and he says, "Thanks very much." We shake hands. His people are on him like immediately, saying, "We've got to go, Mr. President." So off he went out the door, and so I'm going, wow, I just interviewed the President of the United States, and after you turn to the crew to make sure they actually were recording when you were doing it, I looked at the producer who'd done a lot of the work to make this happen. Her name was Samira Hussain. She works for the BBC now, right, in New York. And I looked at Samira, who was sitting on the floor, just basically right between the President and I during the news here. We were just out of during the interview, but just out of camera range, and I said, "So, Samira, how did it go? What do you think?" And Samira Hussain was like the gold medal winner at Concordia, or she's like a great young journalist. She looked at me and she went, "He's so gorgeous." So I said, "Yeah, right, of course, but did we get what we came here for?" And she said, "I don't know, I didn't hear a word he said." So as that's happening, there's suddenly this kind of noise at the door, at the entrance, and look up, and it's him again. It's the President of the United States. He's come back in, he's going, "Peter," because, we're... He says, "I've got somebody you have to meet." And I said, I'm thinking, the President of the United States, that's somebody I have to meet? This is like crazy. And he's tall, right? I'm 6 foot, he's like 6'2", and the guy beside him was about 6'5", big tall guy. He looks at him, and this is the answer to Paul's second question. He looks at him, he says, "This is Marvin Nicholson. He's from Victoria." I'm going, he's gone out, he's heading to the helicopter. He's met some other Canadian. He's brought him back in the White House. Turns out that Marvin, whenever you see Barack Obama playing golf or basketball, Marvin's always beside him. He's his sort of sport buddy. And so we checked that out later in the day, why this was so important. It turns out that Marvin is from Victoria, and his mother told us afterwards that he always used to watch the National, and it was a big deal. And what had happened is they were walking out to the helicopter. Marvin had said to the President, "Mr. President, this guy who just interviewed you, I used to watch him when I was a kid." And the President says, "You want to meet him?" And so they come back in the room, and then the next thing you know, we're standing there shaking hands, and the White House photographer and our producers are snapping pictures of me and Marvin and the President. And Marvin's there next to the President of the United States. And he's shaking my hand. He says, My mother loves you. So that's... Anyway, we've passed our allotted time on Facebook and YouTube, and you know, it's been a real treat for us to be here, but it's mostly been important that we've had the opportunity to hear some of your questions, some of your concerns, and some of your thoughts about not only how we do our work, but why we choose certain places to go, why we, you know, the kind of issues that confront us when we try to cover these stories. It's important for us as the CBC, as your public broadcaster, to be as transparent as we can. That's been the process that Jennifer has encouraged us to be in this series across the country. And I hope that we continue to do this in the future because our correspondents have great stories to tell. They appreciate hearing from you, and they certainly will in the reception that's going to follow this immediately. So we do invite you to stay along. And I need to say goodbye to those watching on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for you for joining us on this night. And for the audience here, as I warned them earlier, we do have water and crackers for you. And who knows, there may be some other things as well. But please stay and please give us a chance to meet you personally. Thanks so much.